In one of my other tapes, I talked a little bit about these things, but I'd like to return to them because I focus a little bit more comprehensively on reading skills per clusters, i.e. strategies. And the issue is, well, how do you actually engage students in thinking through these things to the point to which they reach that threshold, or if it is a threshold, the ability to apply it to other situations without your support. And a number of people, as they pursue this, said, well, okay, what we need to provide is students things like heuristics, and I talked a little bit about those in one of my other tapes, things like KWL, asking kids to lay out what they know, what they want to learn, and what they learn from text, and use this sort of heuristic as an organizer for going through a text. Or a question-answer response approach, which actually gets students to analyze the nature of the task when they're asked a question, whether the answer to the question is going to be found in the text or in the students, from the student's own experience, or a combination of the two. So you've got people who are proposing things like those heuristics as ways by which students could quickly use those heuristics as a means of triggering their approach to text. I myself, again, find myself almost going back to that sort of the pull-down menu concept as a sort of a preference. But as we sort of explored how you actually help students to do this to the point to this doing themselves, a colleague of mine, Dave Pearson, and one of his colleagues, Margaret Gallagher, suggested that what we need to introduce is a model which they refer to as the gradual release of responsibility. And in accordance with that model, that, and this sort of befits the sort of Dolores Durkin definition of teaching of reading comprehension, you start out with teacher modeling, where the teacher explains and models what it is to do. And then you end with the teacher sort of phasing out his support, but the student being able to initiate things like that for themselves. My fear with the model is one of whether or not the fact that the teacher's modeling it becomes doesn't afford the same sort of flexible skill development that you might want, that there's a tendency for students to want to align exactly with what the teacher wants rather than the student actually presenting his own models. Although in reality, it's interesting. I find in the area of self-assessment that I've been a proponent of the teacher doing a form of modeling, but doing it alongside the students. So in essence, my proposal would be is to sort of shift the teacher modeling somewhat and increase the student modeling somewhat at the very beginning. For example, with the use of portfolios, oftentimes I'll say to a teacher, you know, when you think about how you might start this, as you introduce portfolios into your classroom, one of the ways you might want to begin is actually you doing a portfolio and presenting your portfolio to the students so they can actually see the type of things that go into a portfolio, and they can also witness you doing it as well. And you can sort of see the sort of the shift in positioning that I'm occurring, particularly in the area of assessment. It's, I think, wonderful for kids to see the teacher involved in assessing himself or herself, because assessment so often is done to the students, not with the students. And so, again, you can sort of see a little bit my disposition here. And so as I think about the issue of, you know, what's the framework that we should be using to introduce this, I find myself gravitating to a different set of possibilities One is a form of reciprocal teaching, which Anne Palinsar particularly has developed. It goes back to Anthony Manzo's work with the request procedure, where students engage with teachers in questioning. I've talked a little bit about that before. Or a sort of a concept of workshops, where every so often there's the teacher and students get together and workshop and discuss different strategies they've used. And it might be done in conjunction with portfolios. It might be done sort of midstream as they're getting started with projects. Let's have a workshop on planning. Let's have a workshop on at different points in the doing of projects, where there's a form of reflection that you're encouraging people to do as they're engaged in these strategies. I do also want to emphasize, in terms of how you begin to do this, that I find myself aligning with an approach to doing this, particularly if in fact you're after flexibility and adaptability, that you're doing it in a fashion which is case-like. And here I draw a little bit upon the work that Rand Spiro's done, looking at doctors in terms of how they learn their practices. Is they learn it across cases, and the cases give them examples of how they might use different procedures in different ways, but encourages them to develop this sort of flexibility and this case-like sort of approach to moving forward. In a sense, that sort of befits with what Rand draws upon, a sort of a Wittgensteinian concept of how one accumulates complex knowledge by crisscrossing. Crisscrossing a variety of different sort of things as a way of sort of learning and acquiring the expertise. In reality, I'm not sure we have answered the question yet of what should we be teaching and how should we be teaching it. Because in our efforts to research this, the reality is that we've really struggled to achieve the gold standard. Oftentimes people who are using these heuristics will need to remind the students to use the heuristic with a new passage, that they might not do it on their own. I know Anne Brown, who did a lot of the work in metacognition, sometimes expressed a frustration that she needed to encourage students and just to remind them, oh, don't forget to use that strategy. In reality, I think the gold standard is one where students enlist this strategy spontaneously for themselves, rather than again having to be reminded. And so very few experiments have achieved that. And I would speculate, my hypothesis, it may have to do with an issue that I'm going to turn to in the last part of our conversation today, an issue of relevance, where I would argue that there may be a hypothesis that would suggest that if we engage students in a project that's immensely relevant to their life, then indeed we actually might see students not only pulling together strategies that we might be suggesting to them on their own, but we might see them actually enlisting strategies for themselves that we hadn't reckoned on. And so I want to suggest that maybe this issue of relevance, which I want to explore just for a few minutes in the last part of today's discussion. Thank you.